So now we have the next speaker. We don't want to waste any more time. So the next speaker will be Tracey Lauriault. She's an associate professor of critical media and big data at Carleton University. And she joins with us from Quebec, not far from from Ottawa. So Tracey, thanks for coming, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, or actually good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful cross-country event. Can you see my slides properly? I imagine you can, so I will take that as a yes, and I will just get going. Yes, I'm contacting you from Wakefield, Quebec, to talk to you about AI for good. First, I would like to say that we are technological citizens. As technological citizens, we live in a technological society. Decisions about technology are therefore political. We should not leave all technological decisions only to people who know technology, but people who know technology ought to be involved in the politics of technology, of which artificial intelligence and machine learning are a form of technology, and a large social and technological systems. To be a technological citizen, you need agency. To be an agent, you need some power, and you need some knowledge. So therefore, the argument that I would make is that for us who possess the preconditions, have the responsibility to act and intervene in the technological society. And on the side here, I just have some examples of some really interesting initiatives, such as Fair Work, looking at AI and labor, also disability and bias in AI. People may not know, but people with disabilities are often tracked more when it comes to financial technology because they're outliers. There's also practices and policies that governments develop in terms of smart city systems, or smart cities and human rights, or open smart cities guides, are all forms of technological citizenship. I'm a critical data studies scholar, and so I understand data to be more than just the materials abstracting the world into categories and measures and other representational forms of numbers and so on. And I also understand that data don't exist independently of ideas, instruments, practices, context, knowledges used to generate, process, and analyze them. So data are not just technical. If I'm thinking of how I frame data in an AI social and technological system, I might think of technical, ethical, political, spatial, philosophical, technological citizenship, which we just talked about, and perhaps data activism. So if we think of them technically, we're quite familiar with technical ways of thinking about data. This is normally where we spend our time, maybe as data scientists and as engineers and mathematicians, but we can't solve so complex social, economic, and environmental problems with technological solutionism. Technology will not solve the problems alone. Technology fits into a larger social and technological system. So mathematics, statistics, engineering, and science alone is not enough. It's part of the problem-solving equation, but not the only one. If we start thinking of AI systems and data systems that are intricately intertwined with AI and machine learning, we can start thinking of them ethically. And we start thinking of them ethically, we might start thinking of them from an human rights approach. This is one approach, so that in the context of a humanitarian crisis, such as the refugee crisis with Syrian refugees, the Ukrainian crisis, the environmental crisis that we're living in right now, that we ought to have some ethical principles on how to manage information. For instance, during COVID, we ought not forego our rights because we are in the middle of a pandemic. There's also some really important organizations internationally, for instance, such as the Council of Europe, that is actually taking that approach. And they have a very interesting tracking system that provides a huge list of all kinds of different ethical ways to monitor and manage and to consider AI and machine learning systems. But there's also the buying and selling of data. And most particularly with data brokers, if we start thinking of misinformation and disinformation, or we start thinking of surveillance or corporate surveillance, there's some really important initiatives such as corporate surveillance in everyday life, or on the data trail, and very important civil society organizations that are watchdogs in a way to see what government processes and bills are in place, such as the Canadian Internet Public Policy Interest Clinic, that has the responsibility to ensure, or is trying to ensure, that technological systems are in the public interest. So also another very interesting angle. There's also the spatial and temporal dimension of AI, machine learning, and any other kinds of social and technological data systems. One of my favorite ones is We Robotics, comes from a digital humanitarianism who developed the initial crowdsourcing maps with regards to the Haiti disaster, but he's now developing an entire drone system. And the way he talks about it is we need to shift the power, and we need to think of local experts in local areas. So that's a spatial and temporal way to think of spatial data, if you will, from a drone's perspective, but also to have a very responsible process on how to actually deal with communities and to consider how these data work and how to ethically apply the use of drones and robotics in any kind of context. We also have the Arctic Spatial Data Infrastructure that is using very complex collaborative transnational approaches in the north to manage and monitor the ice melting, the new navigation ways that are emerging as a result of the ice melting, but also monitoring climate change. And they have produced a significant number of guidelines, such as data procurement, creation, data management, distribution, again, using data for good. If we think spatially and temporally, we start thinking of the census forms in Canada, and we used to think of how we would, prior to 2011, in a way, we didn't have same-sex couples in Canada ever because they weren't tracked in the census. That's a spatial dimension of things. We think of language, but also how the data not only change across space and time, but they represent who we are socially and statistically. So it's not just objective. Yes, they are objective, but they are objective within a social context, and the underlying societies that we live in change. And we ought to consider AI and machine learning within that particular social context. And we are certainly not the first to start thinking of data and probability and inductive logic and the taming of the future, or even, is the modern fact actually really an unbiased fact, or is there some philosophical production of knowledge context within which facts, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and data are created? And this is just a series of some really important books that think of the philosophy and the history of science and how our society has changed as a result of this amazing work that many of you are doing in artificial intelligence and machine learning. But also philosophically, are data benign? What about the data sovereignty? What about the knowledge produced about certain groups of people? What about ownership of those data? How about these data producing the world, and the AI and machine learning producing the world that we live in? And if that is the case, what kind of world do we want to actually live in? And other models of thinking through, for instance, disaggregated demographic data from a grandmother's perspective and a First Nations perspective. What would that look like if we applied those in our institutions? What would it look like if we applied First Nations information's governance principles of ownership, control, access, and possession more broadly, whether it be private sector, public sector, or civil society? In other words, I would believe in the social shaping thesis, which means that data represent us, and by virtue of ourselves and the environment being represented in data, it changes how we view the world, and it changes how we view ourselves. And we ought to be responsible in how we do that work. There's some really fantastic activities with regards to data activism around the world. Some very current issues, such as the Gun Violence Archive and Database, counting missing and murdered Aboriginal women and other ways of representing that. Thinking about how we count refugees and how we find out who is and is not on those lists and how we use those data, and also invisible data. There are many things that we may want to manage, mitigate, and monitor, but if data are not collected in the first place, how can we actually do that with artificial intelligence and machine learning? And also, even the Data Feminism Guidebook has a checklist at the end on how you can assess your actual, or how you're performing in terms of being more inclusive, being unbiased, and having a much broader perspective in your AI and machine learning systems. So I urge you to take a look at that Data Feminism book. But also, what about the production of knowledge over time? How are categories made? Who gets to make those categories? How do they fit more broadly into our institutions? And when we go and use data, how ought we think of these data before we enlist them in our AI and machine learning systems? How do we think of social bias? How do we think of technical bias? How do we think of structural bias? And how do we have more informed and lucid conversations and critical, sometimes difficult conversations with each other to ensure that we are causing no harm with the systems that we are creating? Just looking further at racial classification systems, for instance, this is an absolutely fantastic book on how racial statistics lie. Again, if we think of spatial and temporal, and we think of the source of these categories, and we think, if we look at the 5 races at the bottom that go back to 1795, how they were ridiculous then, and how they're even more black, white, red, and yellow are still ridiculous today, yet we still refer back to these classification systems in our AI and machine learning systems. If we think of even things of social Darwinism and the origins of the species and the genetics way or the eugenics approaches to eliminating certain groups of people from society, just think of the white supremacist types of issues that we've experienced, or as we call it in Ottawa, the Flu Trucks Clan, how it was really not about the vaccine and it turned out to be about something nefarious and something else, and how there's a belief structure in these old classification systems and ways of thinking. And how do we make sure that our research teams and our design teams don't include that kind of thinking in the way that we actually do our work? And so it's not only about the AI and the machine learning, it's about the data, it's about the systems within which they are in, it's about the institutions that produce these things, and a broader, larger, vast machine of social and technological apparatuses within which all of this fits in. And how do we think through these things together? One argument is to have very diverse teams and to work in a real transdisciplinary way. And to read other things, but also to call out junk science when we get it. For instance, facial recognition and criminal investigations. In other words, can you actually use facial recognition technology to identify criminals simply by doing craniology, as we used to do in the bad old days of eugenics? That would be a form of junk science. Or how about your psychological well-being and other forms of using machine learning and algorithmic ways of doing things to detect, for instance, sexual orientation? And even if it might be 60% accurate, what happens if your country happens to be have huge human rights issues with people who are homosexual? And if 40% is wrong, what happens to that 40% who are falsely enlisted in that particular game? Or how white engineers might build racist code and why it's dangerous for Black people, and to start considering this in terms of how we do science, how we do data science, and how we consider bias. For instance, this is one of my absolutely favorite one. This is a fantastic organization, and Joy Bulyawami is an absolutely wonderful scholar from MIT, and she could not play her computer games unless she put on a white face, which is obviously clearly there's some biased games not even allowing her in, or she had to get a white friend to do a facial recognition so she could play her games. So that is clearly something was missed in the design of that games, but it has been more nefarious beyond games. What happens when facial recognition technology misidentifies people who have darker skin tones than the normal white skin tones of often engineering teams? What about predictive policing, and how might that be a good thing, and how might that be a problematic thing? And again, it comes back to context, it comes back to institutions. It's one thing in a paramilitary police force, as we've seen in some parts of the world recently, and it's a whole other thing in a more peaceful context. Regardless of that, what are the benefits and pitfalls of predictive policing, and how ought we manage predictive analytics? This is the Citizen Lab. We are very lucky in Canada that we have the Citizen Lab. They produced this really important report on how to survey and predict, or how not to, more importantly. And they've taken a real human rights analysis to algorithmic policing in Canada. Again, all of the links to my reports and everything that I have on the slides are here, and they'll all be available to you after this talk. But what about forms of socio-technological critical analysis? For instance, if we are technological citizens, as you are, as engineers, mathematicians, scientists, statisticians, data scientists, etc., what are other ways to unmask or demystify or correct problems in the junk science that I was just talking about? And who can do that important work? And I would dare say would be technological citizens like yourselves, whether it be in industry, whether it be in the public sector, whether it be in civil society, or whether it be in academia. And an organization that you might want to be a part of and pay attention to, whose papers are fantastic, is the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in Machine Learning Organization, or FATML. There's other great literature in AI and classification systems. Here's a smattering of some of the more popular types of literature that's come out. And even the last book here by Jonathan Rabarge at INRS in La Ville de Montréal, where they're looking at the political economy of the AI industry, who gets funding, who doesn't get funding, who gets to produce knowledge, what happens when we invest in Canada and all of our workers and all of our professionals and experts and academics go work into the States, and what happens when major funding comes from the government of Canada and a major AI institution, and then that gets sold to an American company. What happens to the IP when those particular kinds of systems? Again, thinking more broadly of the political economy and thinking about the culture within which this is situated. I'm getting very close to the end here, and I'm looking forward to questions and answers. Here's just some examples of how you can stay tuned in and how you can pay attention to some of the key people who are paying attention to these issues. There's, of course, The Current on CBC, and CBC Spark with Nora Young is absolutely one of my favorites. She's doing an entire series right now on AI and machine learning. The Canadian Internet Public Policy Interest Clinic at Ottawa University is fantastic. Teresa Scassa is a colleague and a friend. She's a Canada Research Chair in Society and Technology, and she pays an incredible amount of attention into new laws, policies, and regulations that are emerging. And of course, many of you would know Law Bites from Michael Geist, where he pays attention to these particular types of issues, but also to the legislation that's coming in play. Again, a broader social, political, and economic context within which all of this is situated. So in the end, did I answer all of the questions on how to do AI for good? Not entirely, because there's so much more that one can talk about at lunchtime in 20 minutes. Did I provide some examples of some good things to do, of some actors who are doing some fantastic work, of some policies and principles that might be available to you? But also, at the end of the day, it's about asking some questions, pointing out that this is not our first kick at the can, that we as practitioners, professionals, politicians, scholars, we are technological citizens, and we ought to create AI systems that are good for society, good for the economy, and good for the environment. At the end of the day, good for all of us, really, because in the end of the day, we are not only practitioners, professionals, and politicians and scholars, we're technological citizens. And with that, I will end the slides and I will open it up to questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you,
Stop
Tracey.
sharing my slides.
Thank you, Tracey. Great talk. I think it was a very interesting introduction to the next two talks that are about ethics and gender in AI. So I love your presentation. So we have a question there.
Thank you. I don't see the question. Are you going to ask it?
Okay. Is the data age inherently dangerous for marginalized communities, or are the problems with AI symptoms of existing real-world prejudice? Is there hope for responsible and ethical AI?
There's absolutely hope, but it's up to us. So I provided some examples. It's the underlying society always. It's not the technology necessarily in and of itself that is inherently bad, but it can be depending on the context and the systems within which it is situated. Again, if we're talking a paramilitary context, let's bring up something contemporary, a lack of gun control context, as we just saw in the United States. If we bring it up in a context of misinformation and disinformation, it's incredibly problematic, and we must address our underlying prejudices. Having said that, how do we do it? Mixed teams, diverse teams in terms of gender, in terms of ability and disability, in terms of how people look, in terms of what people's belief structures are, and in terms of gender and an ability. Some people call it, maybe it should be slow AI, or it should be slow machine learning, where yes, we're trying to be fast and furious and build things very quickly, but maybe we ought to, at the very, very beginning, and look at the problems that we're trying to solve, start thinking of the composition of the teams that we have, and right at the very beginning, ask the difficult questions, so that when we get to the end of it, we're doing the right thing for all of us, and with good intentions. This is not to say that engineers, mathematicians, and so on have bad intentions. I can't do all the work that group of engineers, scientists, mathematicians, data scientists do, and nor can they do the work that I do. So how do we work together to make it better?
Yeah, a great case is that to remind us that we need to work with other professions to solve this. And as I agree completely with you, techno solutions will not solve social problems. And I would like to add something that is important for me from the point of data, that we forget that data doesn't represent the whole world. Data is just a proxy of reality. And that's another problem that we see every day, because people think that data has all the data we need, but data cannot, for example, encode what is happening right now or what will happen in the future. So that's critical. We have one more question. We have one more question. So as we understand better the unknown unknowns, can we say that we might get wider holistic data sets classifications for better AI performance?
We might, but it's not going to be tomorrow. And we're always going to forget things, because our view, no matter how great we are, is only ever partial. If we were to datafy everything in the world, then there would be a scaled model of 1-to-1 of the world. And there's no way for us to be able to do a full scale model of all of the world and all of its complexities. More data doesn't mean a better society. It just means more data. And it doesn't necessarily mean better data, and it doesn't necessarily mean the right data. And finally, and I think to bring up with the great questions that you just brought up and the comments that you just brought up, is there are many people who are invisible in data. Disabled people are invisible in Canadian data trails. We have almost no data about disabled people. We have very little data about certain elements of the workforce. For instance, frontline workers. How could we have a pandemic rely so importantly on these incredibly underpaid people, and we know very little about them? Gig workers. I brought up an image of Fair Work, and Fair Work is about protecting gig workers. That's all algorithmically and platform-derived forms of labor that is supposed to be objective, that has a lot of data, but hasn't turned out that way because the underlying systems are wrong, or the underlying systems are problematic and unjust. And again, we need to think of the context, the institutions, the places, the practice, the methods, and the social context within which we work to make it better. So thanks very much for that.
So we will take some time from Jansu's presentation. As we are from Northeastern, we can have that choice, because there are more questions coming. So
Great.
the question is, what are the dangers of having tech companies investigate and audit their own AI-based products? Sometimes there's no alternate option.
So I will give the example. I come from a long line of people and with friends and colleagues who have been involved in the environmental movement since the 1980s. Imagine if we let big oil self-assess itself in the environment. It's not to say that AI and machine learning companies are as nefarious as many of the big oil companies and the political economy of big oil. But we can certainly say that there's a level of self-interest that's really important. It is true that technologically, we're kind of in a difficult position because we don't have enough people who work in civil society organizations or academic research organizations to actually be able to do the science and the society together, to be able to audit and understand the big tech companies and what they're actually up to. So no, I would never say that companies ought to self-regulate. Ought they have a quadruple bottom line where, yes, what triple bottom line was the environment. Now we need the quadruple bottom line, and that ought to be socially responsible, fair, equitable, unbiased, just, accountable, and transparent AI. But then how do we measure that? How do we assess that? How do we invest in the companies that do that? And how do we divest from companies who don't do that? While the people that are part of this conference, you're the experts, really, but you know that the broader society is not where you are in terms of knowledge. So how do we up the level of knowledge away from fear-mongering, but to the point where we can have a really good critical conversation as to the society that we want, socially and technologically, and then aim for that society with law, regulation, policies, indicators, practices, registries, procurement, guidelines, and principles, so that we can actually do this together. We haven't succeeded yet with the environment. I think, sadly for all of us and future generations, hopefully, because I'm sure that the people who are attending this conference really care about all of those things as well, I would urge us all to figure out a way to improve this AI and machine learning system, social and technological system that we're in, so that it's good for all of us. And that's really going to take a lot of work. And I think we can do better than what we did not do on the environment and climate change, because I think it's an easier win than the social and technological issues when it comes to climate change. So I think it's possible. It's not going to be tomorrow. And I would absolutely not leave it up to companies to self-assess, but we could provide them some tools by which they could govern better their environments, govern better their institutions, and then, of course, that quadruple bottom line on fair, just, accountable, and so on.
So the last question, how we can ensure more STEM students can care about these topics? They're sometimes too concerned about their technical skills and then don't pay attention to the topics like you discussed.
I think students do pay attention because I'm in a university. I get to participate in the data science classes. The issue is the training that we provide engineers, scientists, mathematicians. There's too little time and too much to learn, and it's very technically complex and sophisticated types of work. And we're expecting that same group of people to also be social scientists, to be ethicists, to be lawyers. We cannot expect that. I don't think we should expect that. However, we ought to at least have, we're implementing that at Carleton. We have data science and society and ethics course that's coming up in the data science program, but a course is not enough.
No.
This needs to become part of all of our cultures. Just as the social sciences need to learn more about technology, math, science, and statistics and respect it, the reverse is also true, that engineers, mathematicians, and statisticians ought to be respectful of the social sciences as well as public policy. Together, we can do this, but none of these disciplines can do this alone, let alone within the private sector, where people have to make payroll, they have to manage their entire infrastructures, they have to follow regulation, they have to deal with their accounting systems. So how do we make it profitable for them to be accountable, ethical, and transparent, and to be good social and technological citizens? So I think it is not true that people don't care. I think what happens is we're too narrowly focused in our worldviews. We need to broaden it a little bit, and we need to work together a lot more. So in a way, I'm repeating what I've just said.
So great message, Tracey, to end your presentation, and thanks for being us here. I love your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure. Great questions, by the way.